This is part 4 in our 13-part series of new feature areas in SQL Server 2012. My name is Kevin Goff, and I'm a SQL Server MVP. And just going through the slide deck here, if you're joining this this webcast for the first time, this, as I said, is a 13-part series, a just the facts approach to presenting the new features in SQL Server 2012. Now, just a little bit of information on me. As I said, my name is Kevin Goff. I'm a SQL Server MVP. The only thing you need to write down here is just my my website, which is kevinsgoff.net. The slide deck, and actually I've got a page on my blog that covers this entire series. And so if you go up there on my website, I've got a separate category for this Microsoft webcast series, and actually have a separate line for each week as we've gone through things. So my slide deck for what we're covering today is already up on the site. If you want to send me an email, my email address is kgoff@kevinsgoff.net. And as I said, I'm a SQL Server MVP. I speak mainly in the Mid-Atlantic region. I'm located in central Pennsylvania. And I train for a company called SetFocus. We are a Microsoft certified partner for learning solutions. So if you have any interest in training in the .NET or SQL Server or business intelligence area, feel free to contact me. Our company actually has a free training site with 100 hours of free training. It's actually lifted from some of our curriculum weeks, and it's actually out in the site freetraining.setfocus.com. Now again, all you have to do is just go to my site. You can pull down the slide deck that has all of these links. So the only thing you need to remember here is just my site, which is www.kevinsgoff.net, and I'll show this page at the conclusion of the presentation here today. Well, moving on here, as I said, this is a 13-part series. We've been through the first 3 parts already. We've covered the new column store index that's in SQL Server 2012 that offers tremendous performance capabilities, primarily for queries that go against data warehouses and data marts. We looked at the new Transact SQL enhancements that are in SQL Server 2012. And then last week we looked at one of the more interesting specialized features in SQL Server, the file table enhancement. So I definitely encourage you to go back. There is the ability to go back and watch the recordings of those prior events. And today we're actually going to have part 1 of a 2-part series within this 13-part series on the new features in Integration Services. Now, Integration Services is a major service within the SQL Server stack. Certainly very popular when more and more people are using Integration Services for database jobs, for database extracts, and for your standard ETL. If you're not familiar with that acronym, stands for Extract, Transform, and Load. Different ETL operations that you might perform in a company. And the enhancements to Integration Services in SQL Server 2012 are pretty substantial. So much so that I'm actually going to cover them over 2 parts. Today I'm going to focus on the specific features. And then next week, next Friday, same time, same station, going to take a look at how we might use those features to put together an SSIS procedure, or as we say, an SSIS package. So today, going to talk mainly about the new features, but then next week show how they can be rolled together to put together a package. Now, if you've been using Integration Services before, you'll probably be very happy with some of the new capabilities that are in SSIS 2012. Microsoft has taken a very good tool and it's made it even better. They really paid a lot of close attention to the details of some things that maybe didn't work quite the way people wanted them to in prior versions of SSIS, and they did just an outstanding job of really taking a good product and making it even better in 2012. So we're going to look at the new features today, and then next week we're going to actually look at putting together an SSIS package from beginning to end to showcase how some of these new features work. So I'm going to actually jump forward, since the slide deck is basically an accumulation of all the slides for each week. I'm going to jump through the slides for the first couple of weeks and get to the section on new SSIS features. So as I said, SSIS received a great deal of attention in 2012. It was always a very good tool for extract, transform, and load processes, and now it's even better. They've added some functionality for existing ETL developers, and they've also simplified some tasks for new developers to help with the learning curve. And I can appreciate things from both sides. I use SSIS as an ETL developer. And I also use it in training. I train people on learning how to use SSIS. Well, there have historically been some areas in SSIS that required a little bit of elbow grease, a little bit of work to get a particular area of the product to work the way we wanted it to, and that can sometimes be a little bit of a challenge to people who are working with the product for the first time. Well, Microsoft has taken some of those areas and they've made certain areas of SSIS a little bit easier to use, a little bit of touches here and there to simply take tasks that previously were a little bit difficult and simply make them a little bit easier. And so we're going to focus on the main features here today, and then next week I'm actually going to build a package from beginning to end to show some of these new SSIS features. So jumping forward here, going to take a look at the actual specific features. And I see from the comment box, and I just want to verify something, there were a couple of people who were having some issues in looking at the posted comments. A couple of people were having some issues seeing the video for the presentation. I don't know if this is just a general problem or an isolated problem. If somebody could just verify in the comment box or just give me some feedback that they're able to see the presentation here. I just want to, if somebody could just give me a verification that they're able to see the presentation. Don't know if this is a...
Hi, Kevin. We are able to see the presentation on this end.
Oh,
so
okay.
I'm helping those people that can't see it.
Okay, great. Okay, appreciate it. Thanks.
No problem.
Okay, so first of all, a bullet point list of the major new features at SSIS 2012. And I'm going to get it over into the tool here in just a minute. Well, first of all, for people who work both with Visual Studio for .NET applications and with SQL Server to build BI applications, they'll definitely appreciate this. In SQL Server 2008 and in 2008 R2, even though Visual Studio 2010 was available at that point, you still had to use the Business Intelligence Development Studio that was associated with Visual Studio 2008 in order to be able to create things. You could not use the 2010 interface in Visual Studio. Well, fortunately now the planets have aligned, and SQL Server 2012 includes a version of Visual Studio that's basically 2010. So we get the WPF-based user interface. We can basically use the Visual Studio 2010 shell. Now, you won't see the words Business Intelligence Development Studio, or BIDS, as people usually know it, to create SSIS applications. It actually goes by a different name now. It's actually SQL Server Data Tools. Now, it is still, generally speaking, the same approach, although it's running under the 2010 shell as opposed to the 2008 shell. So they've got it integrated with 2010, and they've renamed it to SQL Server Data Tools. There is now shared connection managers. People in prior versions of SSIS know that connections were scoped to the package. So if you had email connections or FTP connections across packages, you know that you couldn't have a common FTP connection manager or a flat file connection manager across packages. You had to recreate it, or you could use a package template. Well, they've now made connection managers shared within the project. Now they've also added a new capability called parameters that are implemented at the project and the package level. And this, in many instances, can take the place of XML configuration files, and even instances where you would want to create project-level variables. I'm going to take a look at a basic example of that here shortly. After seeing this, you may find yourself in a situation seeing the possibility of using this instead of the configuration capabilities you're using now. There's also a new variable expression task, and this one is a personal favorite of mine. It's a very easy task, but it's a personal favorite of mine because there's now no longer the need to write SSIS scripts to deal with things like incrementing or accumulating variables. If you ever had to drop down to the script level to write a very short C# or Visual Basic script just to do something like incrementing package variables or accumulating package variables that you would subsequently use later in the package, you now no longer have to drop down and write a script. I personally love that because, while I'm certainly not afraid of writing scripts, I'm a developer just like all of you are. It's always a little strange to explain to somebody new to the product that you've got to drop down to write a script just to accumulate a couple of variables. Well, there's now an expression task to do that. There's now undo and redo capabilities in the editor. So, obviously, if you make a mistake, you can actually undo it. Something that's people have asked for quite a while in the SSIS editor. There's now a couple of new expression features, a few new features in the expression language. If you've ever tried to use the isNull as an example, you know that isNull doesn't work quite the way the isNull does in T-SQL. Well, they didn't enhance the isNull. They added a new function called replace null, which allows us to essentially have what we have in T-SQL with is to replace a null value conditionally with something else. There are new native components in the data flow for ODBC data sources and ODBC data flow destinations. So if you're dealing with ODBC databases, you can now very easily connect to an ODBC source or to an ODBC destination. That's consistent with the announcements fairly recently about Microsoft and the direction of using ODBC over OLADB. So obviously important to have that in the tool as well. There is better handling of invalid metadata. Now there are a few of these that I'm going to talk about as a concept this week, and then next week when I actually go through and build a package, going to showcase this. So a few of these I'm just going to speak to, and then next week actually going to show an example of it. This is actually one of them. You almost have to build a package and then change the metadata around in the package to see what the impact is going to be downstream. Well, Microsoft has implemented some things to make dealing with those exceptions or dealing with situations where the metadata in the pipeline changes. They've added some things to make that a little bit easier. They've also added some new native tasks to support change data capture. If you utilize change data capture, you know that you've got to write code against the change tracking tables in order to get information on what's been added, what's been changed, or what's been deleted. Well, you can obviously write SQL code to manage those tables, but there are now some new tasks that are available to read from that data directly within a workflow inside a package. Now, they've also implemented a brand new model for deploying packages. Now, they haven't dropped any existing functionality. If you've been deploying packages using the existing deployment features, either to deploy packages to a file system or to the MSDB system database, those capabilities still exist. However, there is also a new model that in many ways is simplified that people may appreciate, and also gives us some capabilities for managing the execution of the package and monitoring the execution of the package once it's up in SQL Server. And then this last one, this is another favorite of mine. They've added a new capability, and this is actually a fantastic capability. They've added a new capability to dynamically tap into a pipeline without touching the package. If you have a scenario where maybe between two components in a data flow, you decide, you know what, I'd like to write out what's in the pipeline at that point to a text file. Well, what would you have to do before? You'd have to go into the package, you'd have to add another data flow somehow and redirect what was in the pipeline to a flat file destination, or maybe run the package in development mode and put a data viewer in there to see what's in the pipeline. Well, that all involved modifying the package in some way, shape, or form. What Microsoft has done is they've added the ability to tap into the pipeline programmatically from outside of the package. And essentially a data tap is a form of an event that we can tap into, thus the name, to write out what's in the contents of the pipeline to a CSV file without touching the package. So a tremendous capability. Okay, I see there are a few questions that have come through here. One of them is, can a developer that supports SQL Server 2008, 2008 R2, and 2012 customers use the SQL 2012 SSIS development environment to develop packages for all three environments? Can the same SSIS source target 2008 and 2012, or do you have to maintain separate sources? I'll tell you what, that might be something that I'm going to have to take a look at. I'm going to give a qualified answer right now. Certainly, if you utilize some of the newer tasks in 2012, there's some new components in here. Obviously, that's not going to be able to be downward compatible. Now, whether or not you can utilize this interface to support different customers, this is something I'm going to need to look into, but I would imagine that if you're deploying using the older deployment techniques, my initial guess is that you're probably going to still be able to do that. However, I'll tell you what, I want to look into that because I'm not 100% certain. One of the things with the new product is no matter how much people have been looking at it for several months, there are some things you have to go take a look at to be certain. So I'm going to give a qualified, I believe so, but I think there might be some provisions. So I'll document this, and let me take a look at this, and I'll post the answer either on my blog or when we're back here next week, because I want to make sure there aren't any other considerations that I'm not immediately thinking of. It's a great question and one that deserves a little bit of input to be certain. If anybody has any experiences or any observations that they've had in looking at this, if you want to feel free to email me or post a comment on here, I'd appreciate it. But I'll take a look at that. But my answer, I believe, is a qualified yes, but there might be some other considerations that need to be taken into account. So good, very good question. Okay, well let's take a look at these. Let's take a look at these specifically. Well, first of all, I'm going to hop over to my desktop. So I'm going to actually share my desktop here. So 1 second while I hop over to my desktop. And this will take a second as we do the transition here. Well, first of all, let me close the package that I'm in, and I can show the overall environment here. I am actually in what is called SQL Server Data Tools for SQL Server 2012. Now, the overall interface will remind you so much of BIDS that there's really nothing that you'll need to learn in the transition, although there are some capabilities to access the SQL Server database and do some basic database management and test queries out from inside of this environment without necessarily having to go over to Management Studio. But even beyond that, we now get the advantage of the WPF-based interface in Visual Studio 2010. So no more having to lug around a separate instance of the shell of 2008. Well, as far as features, one of the first features here is the ability to have connection managers that are scoped to the project and not in an individual package. In prior versions of SSIS, if you had an FTP connection or a database connection or a mail task, an SMTP connection, or any other type of connection, they were scoped to the package. And if you had 10 packages that were using the same connection manager, you'd obviously have to have a different instance of it in each package, or some people do, they'd create an SSIS template and then base all the packages off the template. Well, you now have core connection managers that are scoped to the project. So I'm looking at an SSIS project right now called SSIS 2012 Demo Project. And we have a capability to implement connection managers. So I can right-click and create a new connection manager right here in the project. And you're prompted for the same thing that you would have been prompted for had you created a connection manager in a package before. So whether it's an Excel connection manager or an FTP connection manager or an ODBC connection manager, we have the ability to create a connection manager here in the connection manager interface at the project level. So I've got an FTP connection manager to my FTP server, and I've also got an instance of my database, and it actually says local ADW 2008, although it's actually pointing to my 2012 instance, although it's for the AdventureWorks 2008 database. Now, I'd actually put this together several weeks ago. There is now a new AdventureWorks 2012 database demo that's available up on Codeplex. But I've got the connection manager. I can go to the property screen if there are any properties that we need to implement. And so the same things that we could do with the connection manager are now available as at the project level as opposed to the package level. So if I open up any particular package, like I've got this ETL example, well, down at the bottom, notice I've got 3 connection managers here. 2 of them are scoped to the project, and one of them is a package level connection manager. So we've got the difference here between the project level connections and the package level connections. So just a nice little feature that can sometimes go a long way, especially again for people who are coming into this tool for the first time. So we can now have connection managers at the project level. Now let me come back here to the slide deck. So shared connection managers available at the project level, so really making for a cleaner approach. Now the next thing, and this is a pretty substantial feature, is new project and package parameters. This can be an alternate approach, and in some instances a cleaner approach when we deploy packages to SQL Server. This could be a cleaner approach sometimes in using XML configuration files. Now, some people are going to prefer the flexibility and the capabilities that they currently have with XML configuration. So they certainly have not dropped any features. But some people might view the project and the package parameter-based approach as something that might be preferable, especially if they're deploying packages up to SQL Server. So we can use these parameters almost like a global variable when we put them at the project level, and we can use the parameters in SSIS expressions just like SSIS variables. So this is also a welcome feature in SSIS. So let me come back. Let me come back to my desktop here. So I'm going to go back to Visual Studio or SQL Server Data Tools. I have to start integrating that into my vocabulary. Well, inside of this project, I've got a parameter up at the project level. So if I right-click on the project parameters and open this, I've got, and that just made a liar out of me. I'm sorry. I put a parameter at the package level. My mistakes. Let me go to the package level, and in the package level, I've got a parameter that I set up ahead of time called local processed folder. Now, this could have been a project level parameter as well. I put it at the package level, but this could have been up at the project as well. So it could have been treated as really as a global variable for every package. And I called it local processed folder. So I might want to pull files down from an FTP server, and I might want to store them in a local file. So I've got a local folder here called CSV exchange rates, and I've defined it as a string. So the interface probably would remind you of the way you might create SSIS variables. Again, this could have been put up at the project level. I've implemented at the package level. Well, I can use this throughout the package in the same way that you might use a variable. For instance, when I want to create that folder, if it doesn't exist, well, I've got a file system task here. If I right-click and edit the file system task, I've told it that the source path here is variable. And if I take a look at my available variables, click the drop-down here, well, that lists not only the available variables, but also any package parameters or any project parameters. So this lists the package parameters that are available, and I can pick the local process folder. So any instance where we would otherwise select a variable, maybe as a dynamic means to create a folder or to drop files into a folder or whatever, the package parameters or the project parameters are going to be available as well. So when I actually receive files into that FTP server, or from the FTP server down to my local folder, well, if I right-click on this FTP task and edit it, and take a look at the file transfer area, well, I'm reading the files that I pulled down into that local process folder. So again, that could have been a package level parameter, or that could have been a project level parameter. Now, I'm going to come back and talk about this a little bit later, because these actually stick with us when we deploy this package to SQL Server. So when we deploy this package and this project as a whole out to SQL Server, those parameters obviously go along with it. And we can modify those parameters when we deploy the package up to SQL Server. So we might have one project parameter that we use locally when we're testing out the project here in SQL Server Data Tools, and then another project level or package level parameter that we use when we deploy the package up to SQL Server. So we can easily change the values of these once we deploy this up to SQL Server. So a little bit later when I go through the deployment, we'll actually take a look at that. So that's a quick look at project and package level parameters. So we'll come back to the slide deck here. And the next new feature, and like I said, that this is a personal favorite of mine, not because it's such a major new feature, as much as it is that it keeps us from having to do something that could be a little bit tedious to do in the past. There's an expression task that we could use to increment and accumulate variables. Once again, if we had a package level variable, and at some point we needed to programmatically increment or accumulate it, maybe if we had a running count of rows that we had processed across multiple files in a loop, and we wanted to take that count and use it later in the package. Well, in some instances, depending upon how you were handling the tally of that variable, you might need to have to drop down to write a script. Well, there's now no longer a need to do that. There's now a new expression task in the control flow that's available to maintain the values of variables. So, as an example of that, I'll come back to Visual Studio, or come back to SQL Server Data Tools. So I'll go back to sharing my desktop again. And back in SQL Server Data Tools, in this particular package, which, by the way, I'm going to actually walk through the creation from beginning to end next week, inside of this package, I'm pulling down files from an FTP server, and I'm putting them into a folder, and then I'm looping through those files, a fairly basic and fairly common design approach here in SSIS. Well, the package opens up each CSV file, not knowing the name of it, and needs to increment the number of files that we've processed, and also the number of good rows, the number of bad rows. In the data flow itself, if I right-click and edit the data flow, well, in the data flow, I'm doing a data conversion on the incoming data, and maybe some rows have garbage data, and we need to kick them out. So, as part of our data conversion, or as part of our lookup, maybe we have some rows that fail a validation, and so we might send them to a bad row count, and maybe later even send them to a file. And then the rows that match the lookup, we might tally them into a good row count, and then maybe send them into a staging table or wherever. Well, inside of this loop, we might be processing through 10 files, 20 files, we have no idea how many. And we want to accumulate the number of bad rows and the number of good rows. Well, these transformations, these row count transformations, are not additive. If they process one file and then there's 10 good rows, they process the next file and there are 15 good rows, that doesn't accumulate the value. It overwrites it every time. Well, we want to capture that. Well, in the package here, if I go to the list of variables, if I right-click and take a look at the list of variables, I've got variables down here for good row count, bad row count, and down a little bit further here, total good row count, total bad row count. Well, again, in the past, depending upon how you were handling this, and you could handle it by doing counts in SQL Server, but you also might want to do the counts here in the package. Well, you'd have to sometimes drop down to write a script just to accumulate the values of variables, because they didn't have an easy way to do that here in the package and then use those variables later in the package. Well, there is now in the toolbox. So if I go to the toolbox, and okay, for some odd reason I don't have my toolbox here, so I'm not sure why I've lost it, but I'm just going to speak to this. There is a new component that we can drag in, a new task that we can drag in the control flow that is the expression task. And so I can right-click on this and edit it. And this basically allows us, using the SSIS expression language, to in this case increment or accumulate a variable. Now, if you've ever written an SSIS script to accumulate a variable, you know that since SSIS variables are not strongly typed, you had to write a fairly long script just to implement 1 or 2 lines of code. Well, here it's obviously a lot easier. Now, we do need to have, and I'd love to be proven wrong on this, but you do have to have separate expression tasks if you want to maintain 3 separate variables. If anyone is aware of a way to have one expression task that will actually modify multiple variables, please let me know, because I'd love to be able to have one of these instead of 3. Maybe there's a way to do it. I haven't tried it yet, but at least we can now use the SSIS expression language as opposed to having to drop down to the script level. So, very nice feature, because now we no longer have to write scripts. Now, never bothered me so much, having been a former C# developer, but certainly when you're going through the SSIS learning curve, having to drop down to write a script for a seemingly mundane task can not be the best experience in the world. So this is definitely a welcome feature. In the control flow is the ability to apply the SSIS expression language directly to package variables. Okay, well, coming back to my slide deck here. Well, next new feature is the ability in the editor to have an undo and a redo. So if you've made a mistake, this is if you've used something like reporting services where you have an undo capability, there is now an undo and a redo in the editor. So if you make a mistake, if you actually drop a task, there is undo redo capability. So certainly a welcome feature in the design editor. Now next here, and I'm going to actually demonstrate this next week when I go through and construct this package from beginning to end. But there are 3 new expression functions are available in the expression language. And this first one is definitely a welcome enhancement. They have a new function called replace null. Now, if you've ever tried to use the isNull in an SSIS expression, you know that the SSIS expression language, the isNull function, only has one parameter. So if you wanted to conditionally evaluate something, and if it was null, replace it with a 0, with an empty string, or something like that, you need to use the question mark and the colon operators that are derived from C# to test for the value of a null and to conditionally return something else that you might optionally concatenate with another value in order to create an expression. Well, if you've never written C#, sometimes you have to go dig for the syntax for that, and that can take a little bit of time. Well, fortunately, it's now a lot easier. There is now a replace null. There is now a replace null function. So if you maybe have a middle initial that sometimes might be null and might not be null, and you're trying to concatenate that with a first and a last name, you can now call replace null, and it takes on two parameters. The first parameter is the column from the pipeline that you're looking to evaluate, and the second parameter is what you would replace it with. So they didn't modify the isNull function, probably maintain background compatibility, but they now have a new replace null function. Definitely much easier to use. Now they've also, if you've ever had an instance where you need to parse a string and determine the number of tokens that are inside of it, or maybe to get maybe the second word or the third word or the third token inside of a string, there is now a new token function to get the specific token from a string, and there's also a token count function to return the number of tokens. This is an interesting feature. If you've ever had to parse strings before inside the pipeline, either using a script or using T-SQL code or trying to come up with a really complicated expression, this is obviously a little bit easier to use. So next week when I actually build a package, I'm going to actually show an example of this, but you can probably take a guess on how these are going to work. So new expression feature capabilities in SSIS. Okay, moving on here. Now for the people who use ODBC, this will definitely be a welcome enhancement. There is now new components in the data flow for an ODBC source and for an ODBC destination. So it's again consistent with the Microsoft support for ODBC. We now have regular ODBC data flow sources and data flow destinations. It's going to be much easier for those who rely on ODBC. And moving on here, much better handling of invalid metadata. Now I'm going to come back and I'm going to speak to this, and again next week when I construct the package I'll do an example of this, but just to speak to this right now, let me come back to the desktop. And go back to Visual Studio, back to SQL Server Data Tools. Well, in the data flow, we have read X number of columns from the original CSV file that we're eventually loading into in this case, into a staging table. Well, when we introduce a file of some kind of source into the data flow, we obviously introduce a pipeline. And so the pipeline actually has, didn't mean to take that option, but the pipeline actually has the columns that are expected to be read into the next component. So if I actually right-click and take a look at the pipeline here, well, we got the metadata for what's expected, for what's coming from the last component and is going into the next one. Well, this is actually a CSV file from columns that, if you've worked with the AdventureWorks data, you probably recognize. The currency rate date, the from code, the to currency code, then the average rate, and the end of the day rate. This is an example using exchange rates from different countries. Well, the components further on down the line are expecting those columns. Well, what would happen in prior versions of SSIS is, let's say that this CSV file now has one less column. Maybe we remove a column from here because we're not using it any longer, or there's some type of change. Or maybe we reroute the pipeline through a new component that has the same columns, but it's just coming from a different component. Well, the subsequent components downstream in the pipeline would complain about that with some type of error, either because of an invalid reference or a missing reference, and sometimes that meant doing a little bit of surgery to the package, sometimes more painful than others or less painful than others, but still you had to make some adjustments to some of the subsequent components if the metadata changed, or if you have metadata that was now no longer valid. Well, what Microsoft has done is twofold. First of all, there is a little bit more of a self-correcting mechanism in here, but even beyond that, there is also, if I right-click on the pipeline, there's also the ability directly in the pipeline to resolve references. Now, when I go through this next week, I'm actually going to introduce an invalid reference to show what we can do. But basically, here are all the columns that are coming from the prior component, and here are the destination components are being received in that next component. Now, if you worked a lot with SSIS before, you know that there was a lineage ID that was utilized. And the problem with that is that you might have had a column that was coming from one component, and then all of a sudden it's coming from a different component. Now, it might have been the same name, but the metadata editor would still complain about that. I sometimes use the analogy when explaining this to people who work with SSIS for the first time. Since I have a daughter who's about to turn 3, it's almost like a kid having a lollipop, taking the lollipop away and giving them the same lollipop. Well, they want the original one because they think of that original lineage. Kind of a strange analogy, but almost seems that way sometimes when you work with this. Well, they've done away with the use of the lineage IDs, and it's now based more on the name of the column of the pipeline. So that in itself makes the mapping and the handling of any references a lot easier. So we can actually deal with the mappings here much easier with this new editor. Now, if we remove columns from the pipeline, it still means there is some work we need to do. But the work that we do is a little bit more of an understandable approach. So this is a pretty significant feature that they've added for scenarios where the columns of the pipeline are going to change, since obviously data requirements in an ETL scenario are going to change pretty regularly. So a new editor in the pipeline that we could utilize to resolve the references. So when we go through and construct this package next week from beginning to end, actually show an example of how that works. So come back to my slide deck here. So as I said, prior versions of SSIS, the design editor was use the term, my own personal term, a little bit temperamental when the data flow components receive a different set of columns from the pipeline. That's because they operated on a lineage ID that would still wind up being an issue if subsequent components were receiving the same column names but from a different component. So they've made this work a little bit more of an intuitive fashion, and they've now implemented a new pipeline editor so that we can handle invalid or change column references certainly much more gracefully. So definitely a great new feature in the data flow. Okay, moving along here. For people who are utilizing change data capture, there are now a couple of new capabilities, both in the control flow and in the data flow. First of all, in the control flow tab, there's a new task to handle the change data capture process. And there's also in the data flow, they've actually added a couple of components in the data flow tab. One is to actually read a change tracking table. If you work with change data capture, that there are a set of specific change tracking tables that map one-to-one to the original tables on which the change tracking was based. Well, instead of reading from the change tracking tables with SQL code, you can actually read the change tracking table as a data flow source. And there is also a splitter that will break apart that change tracking table into one of 3 pipelines. It's almost like a specialized conditional split. If you've read from change tracking tables before, you know that the change tracking, the change data capture feature will write out insertions and updates and deletes to the change tracking table. Well, in the insertions, it's basically the state of the rows, the time of the insert. For the updates, it's the old values and new values on an update. And for a delete, it's obviously the state of the row at the time it's deleted. Well, reading from that table could always be a little bit tricky because you have to read the operation code, and the way they code the operation code, they use values that are they're a little bit unusual. You have a value of a 2 and a 3 for the old value and new value for an update. So we have to know what the operation code is when we read from that table to determine what's an insert and what's a delete and what's an update. Well, certainly not rocket science, but they've made it a little bit easier still by implementing a splitter transformation. that will basically take the input from a change tracking source and split the pipeline into the insertions, updates, and deletes. So if you're utilizing change data capture and you want to incorporate the reading of that information into a workflow, into a package, you can use the new CDC source, and there's also a splitter transformation to break that into 3 pipelines. Now, for people who are using change data capture, well, they might look at this, they might say, well, thanks, but I'm already using what I've been using. That's certainly fine. But for people who are new to change data capture, this might be a particularly helpful task. Okay, now the last 2 features here are definitely important ones, and that's new deployment features in an SSIS project, and a new management dashboard for deployed packages in SQL Server. Now, first of all, Microsoft did not drop the way we deploy packages before. If you were using deployment methods either to the file system or to a package store or to SQL Server, you can continue to do that. But they've added a new package catalog in SQL Server. And it, first of all, it actually requires that you turn on CLR integration for the SQL Server database that you're using. But you can now deploy the entire project from within SQL Server data tools very easily. You don't need to go through the build process or the manifest process. You can deploy them directly from within SQL Server data tools. And once they've been deployed, you can manage settings and parameters and logging and connection manager settings in this new catalog database. And we can also generate reports against historical package executions. So to demonstrate that, let me come back to my desktop again. Well, I'm going to actually go over to Management Studio for a minute, because in Management Studio, we see that I've got a separate setting here that wasn't available in SQL Server 2008 R2, and it's Integration Services Catalogs. This is a feature that you can turn on in an instance of SQL Server 2012. It is only available if you turn on CLR integration. You have to turn on CLR integration in the database too to get this. Well, this is a new destination that we can utilize for deploying packages. Now, back over in SQL Server Data Tools, if I right-click on the project for however many packages, however many connection managers I have in it, there is now the ability to deploy packages directly to that catalog. So we can right-click and deploy, and we get a wizard where we're prompted for what database server we want to deploy it to. Well, I've got an instance here on my local server called SQL Server 2012, and we specify what the folder and what the project is going to be. Well, I already have out here a folder called My SSIS 2012 Projects, and inside of there is the folder for the specific project, SSIS 2012 Demo Project, and that was from a previous deployment. And we see the packages inside of here as well. So this is what I would get if I actually walk through this again. Now, I had already deployed this, so I get the prompt that the project with this name already exists. So I could take next to continue deploying it. And that's all I need to do. It is that simple. And any project parameters, any package parameters are deployed along with that. Well, once that package is up in SQL Server, in that Integration Services catalog, several things that we can do with it. First of all, for the package itself, if I right-click on the package, I can configure it. Well, I get a dialog where we can configure the parameters that were associated with the package. In this case, where the files are going when I deal with this package. The connection manager. Now, I had one connection manager that was a flat file connection manager for the package. I also had, if I go up to the project and right-click and configure the project, any parameters that are up here. So any parameters, any connection managers that were deployed either at the package or at the project level can actually be managed up here. Well, in addition, we can actually run reports on historical executions of the package. So if I right-click on this package and go to reports and take a look at some of the reports are available for all the historical executions. Well, this actually launches a report that gives me the instances of this running, and this initially starts out as a summary report, but we can actually drill down and wait for this to run and actually get some statistics on the instances when this ran and the amount of time that it took to run. Now, in the interest of time, because I got one more feature that I want to talk about this week, I'm not going to get into this too heavily. When we build this package and run it next week, I'm actually going to get into this a little bit more detail. But basically, we have the ability to see all of the different historical executions of this package, how long it took, the amount of time, either as an average or just for each individual instance of how long it took the package to run. Now, there is actually a site. I didn't include the URL for it. I'll include it for next week. There's actually a site that talks about a way that you can author custom reports against executions of the package if you want to implement your own reporting on every time that the package ran. So this is only available if we deploy to this Integration Services catalog. These features are not available if we deploy to other areas. So it's one more reason why it might be a good idea to take a look at this new capability to actually deploy packages to this Integration Services catalog. So look at this a little bit more, a little bit later next week. One more feature I want to talk about here. I have about 5 minutes to go. So I'm going to come back to my slide deck. And last feature we're going to talk about here is SSIS data tabs. Suppose you had an instance where you had a package that was running and you were all of a sudden interested in capturing the data flow from one component to another in a specific pipeline. You'd like to start sending it out to a CSV file. Well, what did you have to do before? You'd have to open up the package, either set up a data viewer if you want to look at it manually, or you might modify the package and send the data to a flat file connection manager. But that meant modifying the package. Well, we can now do it on the outside. This is a fantastic feature. When I demo this at user groups, definitely get a lot of oohs and ahs on this one. In SSIS 2012, we can tap into the identification string of a pipeline, and we can set up a store procedure in that SSIS DB catalog and hook into the capture of the pipeline to write out a CSV file without modifying the package. Now, there's a little bit of a learning curve on the store procedures are involved with this, but it's well worth it. So let me come back to my desktop here, and last feature of the day. Well, let's say I'll go back to SQL Server Data Tools. And let's say that any pipeline in here, like for instance the pipeline here or the pipeline here, any particular pipeline, we all of a sudden want to write out a CSV file every time this package runs, or if we want to have a special run for it to see what's in the pipeline at that point. Well, if we go into the package and we right-click on the pipeline itself, for the pipeline, there's an identification string. There is the name of the pipeline that's associated with that prior component. And then also, back in the data flow itself, if I go back to the control flow, in the data flow, if I right-click on the data flow itself and go to the properties, well, there is a name for the package path for that data flow. So there's some property names that are available for the data flow as a whole, as well as the pipeline. If we identify those, which is obviously easy, we just go back and get the properties from the package, don't need to modify anything. We can, back in Management Studio, so let me come back to Management Studio here. And let me stretch this out so we can see all the editor here. There are a couple of stored procedures that are available in that SSIS DB catalog. Now again, this is only available if we deploy packages to this integration services catalog. Well, what we can do is we can run a stored procedure called create execution to create an execution instance, where we have to set up a parameter for where that package has been deployed. So it had been deployed into the My SSIS 2012 project folder, the name of the project itself, and the name of the package. And that brings back an execution instance. Well, once we get back an instance of the execution, we can add a data tab. And we can actually add more than one. So maybe I want to tap into the pipeline for the data conversion, and also tap into the pipeline where we had a lookup failure. Well, I'm going to add two data taps where we provide an instance of that execution ID, and then we specify the name of that package path, the identification string from the pipeline itself, and the name of the CSV file that we want to generate. So I might want to call one output_data_tap.csv, and then have another one called output_error_data_tap.csv. And then I can actually start an execution of an execution instance of that package. So a little bit of work we have to do with the stored procedures up front. But if we create an instance of an execution of that package that's been deployed to the integration services catalog, and then add a couple of data taps where we specify the package path for the data flow, as well as the identification string for the pipeline itself, that'll actually create a couple of CSV files. Now the question is, where are they going to go? Because I haven't specified a folder here. Well, deep in the folder structure, actually not too deep, in the instance where SQL Server is installed. So on my local server here, it's under Program Files, Microsoft SQL Server 110 DTS Data Dumps. Right now that folder, if I refresh it, that folder is empty. Well, if I come over and I run this, so I'll execute this code. That's actually executing the package. Now that package, because it's pulling down files, well, it actually ran pretty quick. It usually runs in a couple seconds. Well, because there were two files that were processed, because that package had a for each loop that processed through, in this case, two files, it created two different instances of the two data taps. Now it just simply names them output and output data tap 1. Not familiar with any way to have a naming convention that's any better than that. So again, the original package, when it ran, has a for each loop that's looping through files in a folder. In this case, there are two of them, and generated the two tap files here. Now, if I right-click and open them up with Notepad, there we actually have the state of the pipeline. Now, I'm using word wrap here, but that's the state of the pipeline at that point where we set up the data tap. This is a great feature. So again, if you all of a sudden have a package where you previously weren't implementing any logging or capturing of information in the pipeline from here to here, but all of a sudden you have a problem with a package and you'd like to know, geez, what's in that pipeline at that point? You now no longer need to modify the package. All you need to do is capture the identification string of that pipeline, as well as the name of the package path in the properties for the corresponding data flow, and then set up back in SQL Server an instance of an execution ID if that package once has been deployed, and however many data taps that we want. And then when that package executes, we actually get the state of the pipeline. This is a great feature. I've already used this once. So use this once and you really come to appreciate it. Okay, so right 1 o'clock, right on the dot there. So apologize if I rushed toward the end here. I always try to finish on time. Next week, as I said, what we're going to do is we're going to walk back through many of these processes to build a package from beginning to end. So all of next week will be actually creating that package. I've actually usually can create that in about 30 to 45 minutes from beginning to end. So next week we're actually going to build this package. So for people who are veterans to SSIS, might not necessarily be a whole lot that's new, but for anybody who is new to SSIS or just simply wants to see a particular basic pattern that's used in ETL operations to read data into a staging table and then turn around and merge it using a T-SQL merge, which is what that package does. Merge it with a production table. We're actually going to walk through those features. That'll also dispel a myth or a misconception some people have that when you use SSIS, that means you no longer use stored procedures, which is anything but true. We can oftentimes use stored procedures and simply use SSIS to direct the general workflow. Well, the package we're going to build next week is going to demonstrate just that. Now, looking at the questions, a couple of questions here. Is change data capture stabilized to handle alters to the schema without losing the audit history? That's actually a very good question. To the best of my knowledge, when I've tested altering the schema, every time I've done it, I've had to back up the change tracking table because when you disable change data capture on a table and re-enable it to get it to pick up the structure change, you lose the change tracking table. And the only way that I've ever known is to back up the change tracking table beforehand. I don't know if they've changed that in SQL Server 2012. I will check and find out. So I've documented this question, and I'll check this out. But unless there's something I'm not familiar with, or unless something has been added, anytime there is a structure change to a table where you previously set up change data capture, where you have to disable change data capture, re-enable it to get it to log the new change. Unless you somehow do it manually, it seems to drop that change tracking history, so you have to back it up beforehand, but I'll see if there is any other way. Is the SSIS catalog only done at the project level or from any other deployment routine? I'm going to check here very quickly. I've only seen the deployment capability for the project level. I went back to bids for a minute, and I'm actually seeing if there is the ability to deploy an individual package, and I don't see one. So I will verify this, but to the best of my awareness, the new SSIS catalog deployment is at the project level. Then finally, is there a flag or setting in an ADO.NET block that writes to SQL Server database to allow nvarchar columns with strings that have embedded single double quotes and things like Tom's Market? I seem to be able to handle the input with single quotes, but it fails on the output. The only way that I've ever handled that, and that's coming from a gentleman named Bill Walder, and Bill, if you want to correspond over email, maybe might need an email exchange to go through this, but where I've usually dealt with that is in the text qualifier. Sometimes you have to, when you read in the data, you might need to check for embedded single double quotes, but I usually have dealt with that with the text qualifier as well. Now, in the connection manager. Now, if there's more to it than that, maybe we can correspond over email. Okay. So thank you all for coming. Thank you all for attending. And again, next week, same time, same station, we're actually going to go through some of these features again, but as I actually build this package from scratch. So thank you again for attending. Again, coming back to my slide deck here, going back to the first slide. The slide deck for here, as well as information about this webcast series, is up on my website, which is just simply www.kevinsgoff.net. My email address is kgoff@kevinsgoff.net if you want to send me an email.